but tell me a little. I mean, I first became about your work, your writings, some years ago now, and we don't, have to focus on your earlier writings. But my first exposure to your work was the comparative work between Ibn Arabi and Derrida, of course, and subsequently your study of. I think you phrased it as a while ago, but I looked for the work. But the new Orientalists are looking at how a lot of these discussions around Islam are used by various figures from Nietzsche to Foucault and Almond, to kind of as a critique of certain, if I'm doing justice to your work, as a critique of certain positionalities in a Western context.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a kind of, basically it started out with 6 years living in Turkey very early on, and feeling very frustrated with the way Turkey or Turkish culture, this is the late 90s, right? The way Turkish culture was relatively invisible or transparent on most people's agendas, and not just that, but then in a broader context itself, figures like Ibn Arabi, and I did a bit of my PhD on Eckhart, so I was interested in the mystical tradition, and certainly, obviously, beginning with the Christian medieval mystical traditions of Rhineland mysticism, and I did basically the PhD was a comparative study with Derrida. There was a lot of work at that time, and still ongoing, on the relationship between sort of deconstruction and apophatic theology. And then, of course, when I was in Turkey, I taught 2 years in the middle of Turkey in a town called Kayseri, and a Sufi poet and a professor there called Turan Koç gave me a photocopy. This is all pre-digital, okay? So he gave me this old photocopy of the collection, a book by Chittick. That's what really got me started. And I read a quote that it was. I still remember the quote that I read, or at least I remember how to paraphrase it. I remember reading something. Ibn Arabi says, paradise is a place. Paradise is a place where happiness has. No, paradise is a place whose destruction is always imminent. That's right.
Wow.
And I just found that to be a very sort of, quite a profound way of understanding sort of like how the worth or value of something is only ever enhanced or appreciated by the possibility of its imminent removal. And this is a 12th century Sufi poet, right? This is a 12th, 13th century Sufi thinker. And that was really what got me started looking into the incredibly rich tradition of Islamic hermeneutics. And that was really the beginning of, like, I began to realize it wasn't necessarily a conversion to Sufism or anything, but in a much wider sense, an awareness that there were precedents and previous vocabularies, which made me view the kind of theoretical developments that were taking place in the 80s and 90s in so-called Western academia in a much more skewed light. And of course, people had already been saying this about different things. They'd certainly been pointing out this with regards to Neoplatonism and pre-Socratic thought and so on and so forth. But yeah, that was the beginning where I really sort of, and I suppose you say it's my early work, but more or less I've always been trying to do this, trying to sort of decenter the West, trying to sort of, to use Chakrabarty's term, reprovincialize Europe. But at the same time, as a socialist, not allowing that to sort of wander off idealistically in any kind of towards any kind of myopia concerning capital, concerning who, unfortunately, still is very much geopolitically the boss. There's a tightrope there to tread. So yeah, that's really sort of where I began. And I guess with the book on New Orientalism, and now this is like 10, 15 years ago, it was from it probably stemmed from a deep sense of ambivalence towards the theoretical canon. If I remember correctly, like more than anything else, it was almost like every time someone said the word Foucault or Derrida, they would say Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. You know, there was a secular word, Aristotelidics. You know, there was a Western secular version of this, and as soon as Foucault said it, it was out there, and you know, it didn't matter. It was over. Like the conversation was closed. And I think
I've certainly done that myself. I haven't said Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, but Foucault has played a huge role in my own sort of intellectual formation, not so much spiritual, but certainly existential in many ways. And that's kind of a complex history, but yeah, it's yeah, but yeah, no, it's interesting. Well, yeah, it's as if the conversation is over, right?
But I'm sure you found that, like, simultaneously, it's not that you wholeheartedly reject this corpus of theoretical thought, because there is definitely, you know, a great deal of worth in it. And I'm particularly with Derrida. I mean, you know, even though I have an increasingly deep reservation concerning the vocabulary of deconstruction, at least the consequences of deconstruction. I think, to be fair to Derrida, developing in ways in which Derrida's own politics wouldn't have anticipated. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure you feel the same way coming out of Colombia, that there is still at the same time this kind of ambivalent feeling of perhaps almost an Oedipal feeling relationship to this.
Well,
that,
we
you know,
have
on
to
the one
move
hand,
on as well. I think I came across an article. I get all my knowledge from Facebook these days. Started off all about social media, but and that's only a slight exaggeration when I say that. But some article talking about the end of postmodernism and what do we have next and what's coming up. And people have been talking about the end of postmodernism for a while now. But for some reason, people like Foucault, people like Derrida, they don't seem to leave us. I personally have a deeper affinity towards Foucault than I do Derrida. Certainly, Georgetown University more than Derrida, because of his personal affinity and for deep personal reasons, like without going into too many details. But as far as my first exposure to Foucault was his Madness in Civilization, going back to 2001. I walked into books like Queen Mary when I just started my degree then in English, which is my third attempt at a degree. Two previous failed attempts before and long break in between. But I saw this title, Madness in Civilization. What on earth is that? I'd never heard of Foucault before that. So that played a very important role as far as figuring out a lot of stuff in my own life. So that's probably why Foucault I have this personal affinity. At the same time, Foucault alone, or any one of these postmodern thinkers alone, if one were to, I don't think one can only rely on one thinker anyway, but for argument's sake, if one were to rely on deconstructionism alone, it's a very unstable terrain psychologically, just psychologically, to inhabit. I think very useful as far as the methodology, as far as sort of the genealogical approach that Foucault deploys, of course, famously to kind of unpack things, not taking anything as a given that better than I do, but ideas and concepts, locating them within their specific contextual space, as opposed to, and this is very, very important, at the same time recognizing how this isn't the be all and the end all, and there's a long history, long tradition which predates all of this. And noting in your, I made note of your remarks in your current work that the decentering world history, and that's not the correct title, but what's the correct title again, sir? I've forgotten already.
It's probably world literature. It's
sorry.
World literature decentered.
World literature decentered. You make a very important point, which is that what is often done in these types of discussions is to say, whether consciously or unconsciously, explicitly or implicitly, that all these people that went before somehow, not only, they kind of, what's the word? They led up to what we have today. And this is like the best example that we have. I'm not really sure the insight exactly, but rather than looking at those thinkers in their own right as being substantial and beneficial and insightful on very deep levels. And I was hoping you could speak a little bit to that issue as well. Again, with very much bearing in mind that the importance of decentering, that everything doesn't have to inevitably come back to the West, where so often happens in academia.
Yeah, I mean, this viewpoint of constantly looking at the past and only seeing a past which lacks the present, which is one of our optics, isn't it? It's almost we are imprisoned by this optic. We are constantly, particularly if we are for modernists or secularists, we sort of and of course then as well, when we look at other cultures, we see that which lacks in our own culture and so on. I think what I found interesting with the book on the New Orientalists and with people like Foucault was that they carefully delineated this epistemological situation, but it literally never occurred to them to apply it to their own work. So I think that was something I found curious about Foucault, that Foucault could write an entire history of Europe from outside Europe. You know, he even sort of went on three occasions to Muslim countries, and lived in a Muslim country for 2 years in Tunisia. And yet, empire is largely absent from most of his historical analyses. And then, of course, when he goes to Iran, he comes up with the most, I'm trying to think of a benign, charitable way of saying it, like the most uninformed things to say about Iran, that it's a country which has been immobile for a millennium and so on and so forth. So I think that for me was interesting, seeing this sort of disparity. What specifically were you asking?
Just, I mean, you touched upon it a little bit. This problem, the optic, as you describe it, of this presentism, right? We're looking at the past in service of the present, as it were. And yeah, sorry.
And well, I mean, one of the reasons why I've sort of gravitated to world literature over the past 5 or 7 years, and I've said this in a few interviews, in a few podcasts, is because I think I've just been disenchanted, really, more or less, with historicism and deconstruction, which are usually the two theoretical arms that are used to try and decenter and reconfigure global thought. There's something about, it doesn't matter how many times you deconstruct something, you still end up sort of devoting it, lavishing attention, textual attention, physical attention on the canonical work itself. So what I'm trying to do now is almost like a performative gesture. So I'm trying to sort of trying to get Latin American, South Asian, and Middle Eastern readers to read across their continents instead of going through Europe and America. So that's really where the gist of the book comes from. And it is a desire to sort of push these really, really different texts in front of people. I'll give an example, a very practical example that comes through in the classes I teach. And it's a powerful example because it never occurred. I didn't do it deliberately. But are you familiar with? I think it's the Bechdel test. It's the feminist test for a film. You know, if I remember correctly, it's is there a female character in the film? Does the female character have a name? And do two female characters in the film actually have a conversation with one another? And do they have a conversation with one another about something other than about another man, okay? So it's a feminist set of benchmarks to decide if a film passes, I hope I've got that right, the Bechdel test or not. And so many modern Western films fail this, okay? Up until I'd say about the past 5 years. You know? And in my South Asian class, I showed Satyajit Ray's films.
Oh, wow.
And Pata Panchali, and there's a number of his films that fly with flying colors, you know? So you've got these like 1940s, 1950s Bengali cinema that passes this standard feminist test, where so many so-called modern Western classics fail. And that's an obvious example, and maybe it's even a sort of slightly straightforward example, but I think it says a great deal about the kind of presuppositions we have about the modern and the Western and the non-Western. It still feeds into it. And for me, what's the deepest anxiety I have is and of course, Franco Moretti is right that you can't read everything. You're limited by how much you can read. But it is sort of like striking how little we know of these enormous traditions, literary canons, philosophical traditions. And the problem there is that when there is this power vacuum, when there is this, knowledge vacuum, one of the things that I find very disturbing is that increasingly a Western framework is not only sort of reinforcing Western paradigms of knowledge, but even worse, it's getting non-Western subjects to internalize these knowledge paradigms through. And this is, I'm sure, as a student at Columbia, you're utterly familiar with this. You know, this is a real problem. And in some ways, I am a vulgar materialist, because it is in many ways a consequence of very material structures of power and the concentration of capital. But this is one of the things that we are. One of the things that I again, like I said at the beginning, I try to keep in mind when I write these, when I embark upon, if you like, these decentering analyses, that we mustn't forget that no matter how many Nicaraguan or Angolan or Southeast Asian poets we're reading in our classes, and that at the end of the day, the planet still seems to be structured. The capital of the planet is structured in a very Western way, and until that is changed, I'm not sure to what extent the efforts of scholars like myself, and there are many people like me, I'm not sure to what extent those efforts are not simply a posteriori attempts to try and change something which has a very sadly a priori feel to it, you know?
You mentioned something along the lines about
your microphone is a little bit, I'm not hearing.
That's why it's not plugged in. That's why. That was. Oh my God!
I was wondering.
Sorry, I had something earlier, then I unplugged it.
Okay.
So really, I'm not being
heard properly. Okay, hopefully this will make a difference.
That's perfect. Half of my response previously was a Baudrillard simulation, because I was trying to more or less surmise what you were saying. So
that's brilliant. Sorry, my apologies. What was I going to say? You mentioned about how things are presented as such that somehow, if I'm remembering the figures correctly, 90% of the world's population is cast as a minority, right?
Absolutely.
Which is, I mean, it's. I have a sort of dark sense of humor, but that really tickles my dark sense of humor. You know? That's hilarious and dark and brilliant on some level. I mean, for 10% of the world's population to present themselves as the majority and to insist on it and convince everyone of that, that is sheer brilliance, if not anything else. I mean, it has dark undertones as well. Well,
but it is sort of stating the elephant in the room. Yeah, I mean, and it's it's built. So this is some of the problems with world literature, right? If you look at things like when you look at the way world literature and world literature is, I mean, there's a whole debate about the term. You know, it begins probably with Goethe, Weltliteratur, yeah, and it starts out as a very sort of universalistic desire to learn best from other countries. There's something quite noble in it, but at the same time there is this sense of almost kind of bourgeois privilege, cosmopolitanism in it. Then Marx returns to the term in the manifesto, where he really sees world literature as a rolling back of petty regional prejudices and that. So there's something very hopeful in it, but it's really sort of a moment of consciousness, of political consciousness. Marx sees it and speaks about it in tones which almost are reminiscent of the way we talk about the internet today, the digital culture today. He really is sort of quite hopeful about this. And then at the end, in the second half of the 19th century, world literature becomes coined in the US in particular, pedagogically, as a kind of civilizational course, great world classics, Plato and the Ramayana, and everything sort of sandwiched together as a kind of a civilizational sandwich. You have everything all the tasty fillings, but in a very sort of Hegelian sense, ultimately leading up to the West. Yeah, and that sort of like I think that comes really sort of in the 20th century. It is the significance generates from the US. So it is it becomes a kind of US discourse, because it pedagogically it becomes one of the most courses in the US. I'm sure you took some version. If you did your PhD, didn't you? You didn't do your undergrad work in Columbia. But if you had been an American undergrad, you would have definitely taken more.
Oh, it's central. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So that's where, and so over the past, I would say 30, 40 years, the term has been increasingly interrogated. I think Pascal Casanova was someone who pointed out, in a kind of Marxist way, the extent to which the term is political and relies on a constant sort of a constantly shifting political landscape, where an urban, invariably colonial metropolis is trying to control the peripheries, and then sort of. I think more and more people have harnessed it. But I think the main problem is that even though the non-Western is being incorporated into world literature, I argue that it's being done in a very sort of problematic way. So it's taken, if you look at the most famous names from different regions, you see, like, for example, in Mexico, and I'm not being disrespectful to the writers I name, because I love these writers. All the writers I name, I love them. They're not any worse because they are widely known. But in the case of Mexico, Carlos Fuentes is very sort of famous, partly because he married an American actress. A couple of his films became Hollywood films, for a variety of different reasons. He lived in the US. His texts are drawn towards sort of versions of Mexican landscapes which are easily accessible to non-Mexicans. That's not to defame them. They're wonderful novels, but there are all kinds of reasons why he shoots up the rankings of world literature, whereas writers like Heraclio Zepeda or Rosario Castellanos or others they don't have that same sort of kudos. Or to give a South Asian example, I always think of the difference, again, being very respectful here, because I'm not dismissing anybody's names, but the difference between someone like Amitav Ghosh and Mahashweta Devi. That Devi's work doesn't really sort of appear to present itself in any way towards a Western audience. Is concerned more than anything else with an educated Bengali audience, a progressive Bengali audience who have sympathy for the situation of the Adivasis and of Dalits. And they're not easy texts to read. You have to know something about Naxalites and something about tribal divisions and caste in order to get some of the basics. I know personally because I taught them for almost 15 years. Whereas Amitav Ghosh, it's a much more. I'm trying to. I really want to choose I don't want to choose a negative word here, but it's a much more digestible read. It's a much more accessible read. You get a sense in a number of different ways, partly because some of the issues in his books concern questions of hybridity and identity, which are very contemporary Western issues, but perhaps don't necessarily resonate in quite the same way with local readerships.
Right.
And so on and so forth. I mean, we can jump at Turkey. We could say the same with Turkey. We could talk about Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar and Orhan Pamuk. Pamuk is, again, an amazing writer. Won the Nobel, but, there are a couple of factors involved in it. Nothing to his detriment, but clearly his own outspokenness as a kind of diasporic. Well, he lives in Turkey, but as a kind of outside intellectual, his comments on the Armenian genocide and on Kurds, and also some of the ways in which he openly engages critically with Orientalism in his novels, makes it a more accessible read for Western readers. John Updike loved snow and so on and so on, which more or less tells you, no, okay, anyway.
No, this is a very important insight. This has been my sense for some time now, having studied English at the undergraduate level, and being a writer. I wrote a novel many years ago, which I actually was very conscious, and it's like, it was cast. I mean, it was a very consciously post-colonial novel. I'm talking about my own experiences in many ways. I think
you'll have to send me a copy.
Oh, I'd love to. No, I would very much love to. Yeah, very, very happily. But I was very conscious of my. I guess on some level, the writer is always conscious of who's reading, right? But it occurred to me then, even what I was doing many years ago in sort of writing, that I was writing for a Western audience, and I'm Western myself. I'm very complex. We all are, but right. It's if we write for a different audience, then that has different colorings necessarily. So. Yeah. So to what extent are we playing for the I remember this quote from Bowie in this short video, and he was sort of saying that never, paraphrasing him, but never play for the audience. You should always be playing for yourself, as it were. And I wondered to what extent these writers are capable of doing that, right? If they genuinely only wrote for themselves, in quotation marks. Maybe the work would be actually more interesting on some level, in that it would require a lot more work on the reader's part. I personally, as a huge consumer, especially of music these days, as a musician myself, I've always felt, and movies and literature, of course, that the best art for me is the art that makes me work as a reader or a listener, to participate in the work rather than being handed it all on a plate. But of course, that's not necessarily going to have mass appeal. So,
but like, I'm not saying that it's not a sin to write for a Western audience. Sure. Or for me, the problem is the way that our current literary institutions and perhaps much more is based around texts that do that. I think that for me is more, right. There's an inherent laziness to, maybe it's a laziness, or maybe it's a very cultivated consumptive identity that we are, particularly today more than ever, we are led almost algorithmically down certain avenues of tastes.
Right. No, that's a great way of phrasing it, actually. We're led algorithmically. I apologize for interrupting again, sure. But that sort of reminds me, for instance, of Netflix, right? this is going some years back, you know, where Netflix is this behemoth now. Everyone knows about Netflix, but I remember when it was still known, but people were still not necessarily aware of how big a monster this was. When I think House of Cards first came out, and I remember it was like their biggest budget TV, their biggest budget production, right? And I had mentioned to, I was visiting the UK at the time, and for my own research purposes, and I was telling a friend and family about House of Cards. Oh, how brilliant it is, and it's this huge production. It's like the perfect show. And he's like, oh, really? Netflix? And I was like, yeah, you have no idea. Like they've been basically gathering all this data from our, you know, viewing their, so they have the perfect formula. If they want a certain kind of movie, they know exactly where to have the thrills, where to insert the sex, where to insert the music. So I mean, I really appreciate that phrasing you used, led almost algorithmically. Because it is that, well, maybe not so much in literature yet, but it's probably just a matter of time before that happens.
I mean, like you say Netflix, but like when I talk about the internal, like, you know, as consumers, it's bad enough, but if you're also creators, there's a really sort of dark, maybe dark's dramatic, but a disturbing sort of way in which constantly consuming things like Netflix means you're absorbing the parameters that they use. A concrete example, yeah. Muhammad Hanafi's Case of Exploding Mangoes. Yeah, it's a very famous novel in Pakistan, written by a Pakistan, and it's a very funny and clever novel. I taught it 2 years ago, but it's about Zia ul Haq, and in the appendix, the author says author's a Pakistani, right? He's not a. The author says that I'm indebted to a number of sources in researching the Zia ul Haq period, and one of them is a Hollywood film, Charlie's War, with Tom Hanks and Julia Roberts.
No way. That's so
right?
Interesting. That's telling.
And my class all sort of gasped when we saw this. It was like, and I mean, I'm not going to dismiss the whole novel just because of that, but it is really, I just find it really disturbing that people internalize these timelines. This is the bigger problem, you know, these Western timelines. And for me, like, for example, the idea that 9/11 is the most appalling catastrophe ever to hit the planet, you know?
Right.
It's amazing. How do you remember the Shah Rukh Khan film about the Muslim who stutters and goes to
I'm not a huge Bollywood.
So when 9/11 happens, he goes to the White House to apologize to the US for. I can't imagine anything more stupid than that.
Well, this is the power of a lot has been written about this. Maybe not enough. It's not known enough about how the culture industries, and of course Said famously wrote about this, but writing a much earlier period, how the soft power is exactly that, soft power. And it's intimately connected with the sort of political machinery, right? So how 9/11 was projected as you put it, as being the most horrific thing to have ever happened. I mean, people bought into that. And this stuff is not accidental, right? But it's also very scary, because how many 9/11s have happened prior to that on non-American soil, right? On non-white soils. How many 9/11s have happened since that, and probably on much larger scales, actually, right? But of course, the memory isn't allowed to develop somehow, right? The Western timeline, as you put it.
So, I mean, and that's, I suppose, what is most encouraging about some of the recent events of the past, I would say, 2-3 months, yeah, with the Black Lives Matter. I like the historiographic turn that it's finally taken. So we are, because for years, many, not just, obviously, many people, including myself, have been trying to point out that, Churchill's main dispute with Hitler was territorial. It wasn't ideological. Churchill was as close to an English fascist in many ways. And to say that is heinous to so many English ears. And it is good that we are finally having, it's finally acceptable to speak these things, even if within the UK, I don't want to depress us both by talking about UK politics.
It's okay.
But I did feel that, I do feel very frustrated about the way any kind of discussion, historical discussion about how the state of Israel was founded is locked down.
Yeah.
And I think it's very telling that the Keir Starmer team in Labour have just decided, I think it's a calculated decision. I don't know necessarily if they are, I'm sure they're much more moderate. I'm sure they are much more Israel friendly than Corbyn. Corbyn's team was, but
Sure.
I think in many ways it is a strategic decision. They've decided that we can't take on the media consensus on Israel. We just can't. You know, the moment we say something, every single news coverage from morning till evening will have the name alleged anti-Semite after our name. And I think that's really disturbing that we can't talk about that. You know, it's our identity is so locked into some sort of, you know, to some sort of post-war liberal democracy, you know, and our demonizer there, quite rightly, is Nazi Germany. No problem with that whatsoever. But we are so locked into that historical relationship, if you like, you know, because you know, I remember, I'm 50 years old. I remember for 40 years after the Second World War, Britain mentally still lived in 1945, right? You know, so many World War films. I remember growing up, you know, Dad's Army, and we just lived, you know, 40 years on, and we were still making jokes about the war and that, because it was the last time we saw ourselves as genuinely good, and it was the last time we had any kind of geopolitical power, right? But for all of those reasons, you see today that there are some things which are just kind of, you cannot articulate, whether it's Churchill, whether it's the establishment of Israel. And I guess, like, one of the things, the most glaring things I find as well is the genocide of the Belgian Congo. I find it amazing that we don't speak, you know, our most famous, one of the most famous novels in the English language is set in the background of the genocide of the Belgian Congo, right? Heart of Darkness. You know, it's like Poe's purloined letter. It's hanging right in front of our faces, and yeah. So this is the problem here. Like, getting back to Hanafi, like, it's not about, you know, watching a Hollywood film, but it's the much deeper worry that it is still material structures of power that are dictating the parameters on which our collective memories will be decided. And that is what makes me wonder whether the kind of stuff I do really has any effect, because maybe the problem is a much more material one. We have to, I mean, maybe one of the things which is going to descend to world literature more than anything else will be the rise of China as a major economic and cultural power. You know, and in that case, we'll get Western-centered narratives replaced by Sino-centric narratives,
right?
Which at least will be a change. You know,
well, at least will be a change. Whether it's better, God knows, right?
I mean, yeah, who knows if it's better or not? But you know, this is the problem here, that I'm not my politics are hard left, but I'm definitely not an absolute materialist. I do think culture and cultural change can bring about material effects, but yeah, I really think it's important to keep in mind the structures of capital. Yeah.
Well, that's incredibly helpful and very insightful. Going back to Foucault, I mean, for better and for worse, despite everything that you've said very insightfully, and despite my own certain misgivings, somehow Foucault still helps me think through a lot of things, for better and for worse. His idea of, you know, the power knowledge dyad, I think maybe implicitly that includes the cultural aspect, or maybe if we combine, you know, say power knowledge culture, create to coin a triad of sorts. Can that help us think through some of the problems with this notion of world literature, and how do we go about decentering, in addition to writing about these things, in addition to critiquing them from a very serious academic point of view? Is there something to be said perhaps for attempts, more artistic, explicitly artistic attempts at redressing, representing a different narrative, or maybe presenting anew, in some cases for the first time? It's interesting, to put it mildly, that the South Korean film Parasite won the Oscar this year, which I thought was incredible, and it's such a brilliant film. I got to finally watch it many months later, relatively recently, which in some ways is completely not referencing the West at all, right? In some of its aesthetic sensibilities, maybe it has it's drawing in some ways implicitly on a more sort of Western artistic sensibility. But
I mean, I guess the materialist cynic point there would be that it's a South Korean film.
It's South Korean.
It's the good Korea, right?
It's the good Korean, right. What did you, just as a cultural moment, do you think it, we don't have to dwell on it, but did you think that was a step in the right direction?
Yes. I mean, I think, no, absolutely. I loved the film. And I loved, I don't know if you've seen Burning. It's another, kind of almost like an anti-capitalist ghost story, which came out last year. No, I love the film. And I think that, of course, in terms of, but I do think that one of the reasons that enabled it to emerge I think if it had been if it had been an amazing piece of North Korean cinema, I don't think we would have seen it. But I do think there is something. But it doesn't explain it all, and it's not. I don't think it's a watertight scenario. I agree that there's a lot of possibility for, as Foucault would call it, resistance. Yes. And I think two examples of that, I suppose, if we want to sort of think of helpful moments where we can be open to what Foucault called the thought from outside, so not just simply regenerating structures of power, but thinking they're radically different. I mean, two examples of that, of the non-West forming moments which culturally influence the West, even though they come from very disadvantaged positions, would be, I would say, the Latin American boom, of magical realism. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Borges, these are writers that come from Argentina, from Colombia, from Chile, but they've had a completely formative effect on many European and American writers. And then I suppose another example would be the explosion of post-war Japanese popular culture, particularly youth culture, which has wiped clean and written anew the animated film in the West. It dominates. It's not an exaggeration to say it absolutely dominates. Even in the old domains of Hanna-Barbera and Disney, the Japanese anime has really sort of is here to stay. So these are hopeful moments where, and when you look at, just to stay with Japanese culture for a moment, when you look at that, it's very interesting how they, I always find, because I do watch a lot of anime, and I shouldn't say this online because I'm a literature professor, probably lose my job, but I love anime, and I love watching a lot of the Miyazaki films as well. And I find it fascinating the way they appropriate Western culture, because they do it shamelessly and irreverently. I can't remember the name. There's an anime about a set of robots that are breeding monsters, but the characters in them are. One's German, but he has an Italian name, and they're completely, the way we do with Oriental culture, right? They just grab names from anywhere, a European, just shoved it together, and I love that. I think that's, I welcome that. They finally do to us what we've been doing to them. But there is this, there is this sense that by bringing these very, very different forces together, something radically new will emerge. Some kind of creative interplay will emerge. But of course, then, we do have sort of very serious, the whole language, the whole controversies around cultural appropriation comes from this kind of dialectical backlash, right? That there's a concern that from purists in all directions that sort of histories of violence and suffering are being overlooked in these moments.
On one level, the cultures function by consciously or unconsciously adopting aspects from other cultures, right? This is how they're always enriched. This is how it's always happened. But to your point just now, the overlooking of the violence that often happens, that this is the problem. It's not necessarily a problem. I don't know. I don't think. I don't know. It's difficult to talk about these things, right? Because when a white person, right, English, American, what have you, dons, shall we say, a Chinese dress, then it's obvious cultural appropriation, I feel somehow on some level, I'm sort of treading in politically incorrect language space right now, but maybe on some level the discussion has to be complicated a little bit, right? It's like, at what point is the person just appreciative of the dress itself, right? And where does that sort of aesthetic sensibility end, and where does cultural appropriation come in? Is it just because it's a relationship of power? Is it always a relationship of power? I mean, I don't have a simple answer.
I mean, I think there's definitely a spectrum. And on one end of the spectrum, there are things which I think we would feel fairly comfortable calling cultural appropriation, like, I don't know, a football team like the Washington Redskins, doing stupid dances and that. I don't have any sort of real qualms about calling that out.
Yes.
And of course, to some extent, sort of like white kids rapping and so on and so forth. It's clear, like, where. But then, of course, as you say, going in the other direction, if someone like, if a 19th century English poet at the height of empire, okay, if a 19th century English poet is genuinely moved by the translations of Mir or some ghazal, and responds in kind, is that appropriation? Like, yeah, I mean, of course, in one sense, he at that moment in time, at the height of the East India Company, clearly there is a background there. But at the same time, a poet just reading in candlelight a parchment in his room in East London. Yeah, I mean, I think there is a spectrum of things we should, and of course the obvious deconstructive gesture here is to point out that cultures always leak, that there's always some kind of network that goes on to other cultures, that there's no pure languages, there are amalgams of other languages which are going on and on. And I guess, like, what I always feel as a Christian, and I say this in my class in Qatar, is that, if you really want to get sensitive about these things, then Christians and Muslims, we shouldn't express our faith at all, because both of our religions have appropriated each other. Well, I mean, obviously Christianity appropriated Judaism, and then Islam has appropriated elements from Christianity and Judaism. Like, we should shut out. If we're really serious about this, where do you stop? I mean, there seems to be
just the current discussion in Turkey, over the Hagia Sophia, right?
Yeah.
I mean, speaking of sensitive issues, right?
Yes, very. Yeah, I felt something about that. I did.
I'm very complicated in that I obviously come from a Muslim background, born and raised, was a practicing Sufi for 15 plus years, was very comfortable in my sort of perennialist, Schuon, Said Hussein Nas, Martin Lings type of Sufism, was a disciple of Martin Lings and through Martin Lings, Schuon, but also Said Hussein Nas. Until 2016, I had a conversion experience. I was attending a Methodist church. Through them, through Schuon and these people, I had a deep appreciation of all the traditions, not least of all Christianity. But there was never any question of me converting. until Easter of 2016, my first ever Easter service at a Methodist church in Philadelphia. I felt called to take communion. And I, as far as I'm concerned, I experienced Christ, and that completely changed my. I mean, it really threw me threw me off, to put it mildly. And subsequently, soon thereafter, found Eastern Orthodoxy. Was baptized in the Orthodox Church in 2016. So the question of Hagia, I mean, I mentioned this in relation to Hagia Sophia. So it's like I don't know where personally I sit on this. Because I really don't feel like I've turned my back on the Islamic tradition. I have deep respect for it, love and respect for it, and a deep love and appreciation of Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy. And but on this point, it's like I don't know. It's complicated. It's political, and they're saying they're not going to hopefully remove the icons. That would be a huge tragedy if they do. I mean, it's the icons have withstood the test of time up until now, right? God knows what Erdogan decides to do, but
I mean, I guess like my response to that was slightly colored by the fact that I have a lot of Muslim friends who are I mean, I would say some of them are conservative, some of them are very political Muslims, a couple of them are even political Islamists. And they're constantly telling me, oh, it's so good that, scholars like you, Westerners, are pointing out this cultural amnesia. And I am happy to do that. Literally for most of my academic life, I've been pointing out the way Islam is involved in the history of Europe and so on and so forth, right? Lamenting the deletion, the airbrushing out of Islam from Europe. And then as soon as the tables are turned, I was just disappointed to see so many of them.
It's disgusting. It's honestly disgusting. It's I don't know. There's no question. Historically, this is absolutely the case that Christians were brutalized. Historically by Muslims, in particular Orthodox Christians, and that fact has been what's the word? Not comfortably, but conveniently comfortably forgotten, right? And this is just another nail in that coffin, it seems to me, right?
So they would say that there's a larger. Some people would say, because I've had these conversations. Yeah. Some people would say there is a larger external conversation going on, in which the conversion of the reversion to a mosque is being inserted into this kind of intolerant Islam discourse, and is being traded like a chip around the world to legitimize various discourses. And I mean, on one level that's true. I don't doubt it for a minute. Sure. So many things which are true locally have this inverse effect internationally.
Sure.
Yeah. But I guess it is getting back to this idea which you mentioned about 5 minutes ago, about the way we are deleting. We're just reluctant to acknowledge the violence in our own narratives. Yeah, yes. We'll gleefully acknowledge the violence of other people's narratives.
That's easy to do.
Yes,
that's very easy to do. It's very easy to point the finger and say that person over there is evil, because that assumes I'm good. But the real challenge that all the religious traditions, invite us to embark upon is to ask myself, am I indeed the evildoer here? And how am I sort of wronging other people? Because on some level I will be, unfortunately, by sheer fact of being a human being. If let's say, God forbid, if I manage not, God forbid that I have wronged another human being. I'm sure I have historically. But just my relationship to the non-human world, it's a relationship of complete inequality, right? So on that very level, I'm doing wrongs. So the very least I can do is acknowledge my fallibility. But no, exactly. I mean, it's too easy to point fingers, and Muslims do this all the time. And that's a huge problem. Yes, we should always point out the wrongs that are doing, and I understand the sort of psychological function that plays in addition to the political function as well. But I would also challenge, any Muslim or otherwise, to show me in the Quranic narrative where the Quranic narrative it says it's okay to be the victim, or in the prophetic example, the two sort of touchstones in the Islamic tradition, of course, where the Prophet was abused his entire life. He never took the stance of a victim, right? And so these narratives are very kind of, at least for me, they strike me as, on the one hand, they're important narratives, right? We shouldn't lay down and sort of, okay, yeah, just trample all over me, treat me like a doormat. But for me, for a long time, I got, being, of course, having done my PhD at Columbia, like there's all these big name post-colonial theorists there, and I kind of really jived with that for a while. Then I got really bored after a point. It's like, okay, but then what? Like, I want to have conversations that take the discussion further, right? Yes, I absolutely get the historic fact of European colonialism's complete brutalization of the colonies and the power dynamic and so forth. But is that where the conversation ends? Because up until now, it seems with these post-colonial theorists that's as far as the conversation will go, right? I mean, and this is where I think the work that you're doing and have been doing is more interesting for me, in that it's more productive of something, and it's shedding light on stuff that's very creative and blossoming, and it's not all woe is me type of stuff.
I mean, to speak briefly, like on behalf of those Muslims who, like, I understand, like, where they're, as I'm sure you do, like, we are in a time where, probably to an unprecedented degree, Muslims, certainly the past 50, 70 years, Muslims have been attacked and murdered on levels.
So that's my dog being annoying. I apologize.
Sorry?
So my dog in the background is being
yeah. I understand how it's hard to acknowledge, and Said says this actually. One of the points I like in one of his essays is that he says that Arabs and Jews share this in common, that first of all, they both have diasporic communities. They both have diasporic cultures, basically. Secondly, they both suffered tremendously. Whether it's a Shoah or a Nakba, there's some sort of basic traumatic moment of violence. But thirdly, he says, most interestingly, the thing they have in common is that neither can fully acknowledge the suffering of the other. And I like that. It's what I always liked about Said, and it's not. I'm sorry. You have a post-colonial dog. It's not that he's a saint or anything. I think there's all kinds of problematic reservations you can have about Said, but I really like the fact that, as you just said, he was someone who wasn't just harping on an Arab identity or just endlessly repeating the essence of Palestine, but he was looking for some kind of point in the future where Israelis and Palestinians could meet and speak. And there are people on both sides who do that. And I don't mean this in any kind of New York Times piece.
No, of course, yeah.
But I mean in a genuine way, like being aware of the material inequalities, but still sort of trying to find some kind of new language. There's an Israeli director, I can't remember his name. He did a film called The Band's Visit, which I think was about a band of Egyptian musicians that arrive in Israel and just get treated like crap, and they get sent out to the desert. And it's a very melancholy, wry film, but I think it, much more than any film which attempts to address directly the theme, it really brings out in a very sort of subtle and powerful way some of the melancholies in both Israeli and Arab subjectivities, and some of the tremendous sense of disappointment in both Israeli and in this case, Egyptian sensibilities. You know, the fact that we both share a profound frustration with the histories of our own states. Yeah, and in those kinds of spaces, that I really think, you know, where authentically people are trying to sort of meet one another, there is a chance for something very new to take place. But it sounds very anti-essentialist, doesn't it? Because every time I talk about that kind of anti-essentialism, that very sort of postmodern way, that kind of Nietzschean space where you're endlessly creating and recreating your own self, yeah, it's all very well to do that when you have your own state to begin with, right? But when you have someone's boot on your back, it's difficult to sort of like embark upon this Nietzschean recreation for self, you know. So I whenever I talk like that, I kind of check myself, because I'm not sure. The whole point of being a socialist, I guess, is to establish these material frameworks, these material leveling of playing fields, so that then something interesting can begin to take place. But until that point takes place, you are trapped. And this is where I understand Muslim anger. You are trapped in this constant, almost plaintive voice. Yeah. But this was when I argued with my Muslim friends about the Hagia Sophia, this is what I was saying to them, because many of them, not all, but some, there were many Muslim friends who absolutely did not like what was happening. But there were some Facebook friends who said, well, it's just happened, accept it, get over it, stop whining about it. And I thought, okay, honestly, on one level, I have complete respect for that. But then don't ever talk to me about any, if it really is your position, power has taken place.
If this is the argument, this is the level of your argument, let's apply it across the board, right?
Right. As long as you sort of ontologically, consistently apply it in your own life, I have no problem with it, right?
Well, this is the hypocrisy, right? And speaking on behalf of my family, right, my Muslim family, like my extended, right, Muslims, I mean, whatever, I can't speak on behalf of anyone, but I see that, I feel that I have the right to say these things. Like the Prophet famously said, speak truth, even if it's against your own self. That's actually the hardest thing to do, right? It's easy again. So, right, I mean, I think we have to be honest, and we have to be critical of ourselves, because if we can't rectify our own selves, to use the Quranic language again, I mean, it's at least an idea that's prevalent in the Quran and the prophetic examples, that if we see good, then we should praise God, because this has come from God. If we see other than good, we only have ourselves to blame. In other words, we're not taking on the responsibility as God's vicegerents to do the good work, and which isn't to say that there aren't injustices in the world, right? Absolutely, there are injustices, and we should always stand side by side with those who are oppressed. There's also a prophetic tradition, very tellingly for me, where the Prophet, addressing his companions, he said, he told them to give victory to the oppressed and the oppressor alike. And the companions responded, "O Messenger of God, we can see how we can give victory to the oppressed, but how do we give victory to the oppressor?" And the Prophet said, to paraphrase, by freeing the oppressor from the oppression of their own oppression, right? So there's a type of facilitation that we have to offer, not to constantly demonize, right? If we're constantly demonizing, yes, wrongdoing is wrongdoing, to use very theological language. I'm of the belief more and more that we should call evil evil. We should identify evil, revert back to this theological language and say, this is evil. But then not to maintain the kind of very clear position in all these great traditions, that the evil deed should not be identified with the evildoer, right? The person always has a possibility of rectifying himself or herself. To see them as human beings who've kind of, they've kind of fallen into hard times, spiritually speaking. But anyway, sometimes these discussions are hard to have, because how do we start to, that necessitates seeing Trump as, you know, to use that sort of fun bogeyman of contemporary times, that I mean, he's also a human being on a very real level, right?
I think there's something deeply. I mean, I don't like anything that Trump represents.
Right. Same here. Yeah.
But, obviously, yeah, like as I'm sure. But I certainly don't have any truck with the kind of easy, anodyne, liberal political demonization, because you know, in many ways, if half of the things he was doing you were to take out and just put them in the mouth of Obama, I'm, you know, for instance, the idea that Trump does something, we must automatically dislike it. I mean, pulling out of NAFTA, I'm sorry, I have no problems with pulling out of NAFTA. NAFTA is a free trade agreement which sort of was disastrous for Mexican people as well as for ordinary American people. I think there's all kinds of ways. And I guess getting back to this idea of like the human and the, I've always felt that looking at things systemically harmonizes with that spiritual point you're making. Yeah?
So true.
I even don't, I mean, it's easy for me to say because I've never been physically assaulted or really badly hurt by a skinhead or a fascist. But I see sort of skinheads and fascists as symptoms and consequences of a much deeper malaise. Like, obviously, I have no truck with them, and I think they're dangerous, and I don't want a society where they exist. But I think, you know, even when we get to the police, for me, in many ways, the police are the plantation owner's dog. You know, it's pointless getting angry with the dog.
100%.
So I think that when we look at things systemically, I think it perhaps helps us to sort of like get less worked up about the face. Because you know, you and I both, I'm sure, know liberals who foam at the mouth about Trump.
Oh my God, it's so boring after a while, you know. It's, again, I mean, I'm not a fan of Trump at all, but you know, to constantly demonize the guy, like, how is that helping anything? Right? It's we have to, I think, find ways creatively, spiritually, intellectually, of bridging gaps. Right? If it's an endless discussion of liberal versus conservative in the US context, right? We're never going to get anywhere, you know. It's just because that back and forth never ends. That's a never-ending back and forth, and liberal politicians don't have the answers because they ultimately don't care about the masses. They really don't, and that's just how politics is. This isn't conspiracy theory. This, anyone who reads it realizes very quickly, and yet there's some very educated people. I mean, you know, that I know who somehow buy into this narrative. You know, it's, oh my God, we have to, it's Biden or bust now. You know, like, have you not learned anything yet? Like, I mean, Obama was supposed to be the great savior of the world, right? I mean, people in Muslim countries were celebrating. I remember when he you know, was elected, right? I was in the States at the time, and my then wife was like, oh my God, Obama. I initially was like, yeah, Obama. And then I remember hearing, I forget his name now, one of the senior political commentators on Al Jazeera. He took the journalists around him to task. They're like, we're supposed to be journalists here. We're supposed to be critical. Like, why are we getting sapped up into this kind of fantastical sort of mode of thinking? Like, let's actually see what he does, you know? And I'm sorry. My dog is being...
No, it's okay. It's right. Lends a certain air of authenticity to the dialogue, so don't worry about it. But again, you know, in a way it does, I'm just making connections here, it does get back to this idea of the kind of landscapes, whether it's literary, whether it's political, that are constructed for us. And then we have to inhabit them, and then we have to have the kind of conversations that we've always had about them. And this is what, both in the UK and the US, we've had these landscapes for well over 70 years now, right? You know, this sort of like liberal versus, you know, Tory and Whig, liberal, you know, Democrat and conservative. And I think that there is a kind of, I mean, you mentioned conspiracy theory, but there is a very sort of the establishment is very invested in keeping this conversation within sort of anodyne parameters.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I don't know, like I listen to Radio 4 and I end up sort of shouting at the radio, but they don't really do very edgy stuff.
No.
But last night they had the Moral Maze, it was on basically on imperialism, empire, and the morality of empire. And I think they're probably doing that because David Starkey, the notoriously racist historian, was always associated with the Moral Maze, so there was a bit of liberal apologia there. But one of the speakers was very interesting because in this back and forth about empire and the rights and wrongs, and you know, these various people come up saying that empire wasn't so bad, you know, given the railways, the familiar sort of like groups. And then there was a very passionate woman speaking against it, saying, and really sort of a bit like you talked about, sort of completely seeing empire as the fons et origo of all, had an extremely a very singular impression of the violence of empire and not being able to see anything else whatsoever. And one of the panel really sort of like talked about capitalism. And it was really refreshing because she said, well, you know, we're going back and forth about this, but maybe it would be helpful to think of capitalism as a kind of empire, as a kind of empire that we don't see, as an expansion of, I think it was Nesreen Malik who said this. But I think this is the kind of conversations we need to, but we do need to break open once more, even if it's using, you know, vulgar, crass materialism sometimes has a purpose, You know, when these culture-loaded wars get sort of too entrenched in their own terminology, sometimes it's really useful to say, well, actually the same set of banks finance both the Republican Party and the Democrat Party. Or, you know, I mean, sometimes it's useful to, materialism can be, I think, it can be an end in itself, but materialist analysis can be a useful crowbar to break open some of these cliche, atrophied discourses and bring about, and I think thinking about capitalism as a kind of empire was a useful moment in that program.
Journalists talk sometimes, what's it called? Investigative journalists, they talk a lot about following the money, right? If we just follow the money, the sort of global flow of capital. I'm sorry, I think we'll have to close soon. I do apologize.
No problem.
I took her to the loo earlier, but I feel that she didn't go properly. So I think this is usually how she gets when she needs to go. I'm so sorry, because this is such a really rich discussion. she's asserting her right to.
Sure. Okay. Really. Thank you for having me on your. Oh
no, such a pleasure. Genuinely, such an honor, and I'd love to have future conversations with you. It's you know, very very interesting to hear your very nuanced positions on multiple things, and this is the kind of, I really believe this is the kind of approach we have to have in order to whether we affect change or not. I mean, that's ultimately in God's hands, but to actually question things, to actually make sense of the world. For me, I'm just trying to make sense of things half the time, and because there's so much nonsense out there. If we don't have a sort of very complex, granular view of things, it just becomes impossible.
Sure. Okay, well, again, thank you.
No, God bless. Thank you so much. Truly a pleasure.
Take care, Hasan. I hope we get a chance to meet up physically at one point. Okay.
I'd love that. Whereabouts? Where are you based? Did you say?
I'm in Preston at the moment. Yes, in Lancashire. So.
In Lancashire, right. So yeah, once.
Qatar in a month's time.
Yes. Oh, you're going back in a month's time. Okay, right. Well, if you're in London. if you're in London before that, and we can. I mean, I'd love to meet up for an actual physical coffee, as we used to have before this. I mean, God knows where all this is going to end up, right? All of this is also, I think, lots to be unpacked. I think, but anyway, for another time. But
take care, Hasan.
Thank you, and take care now. Bye bye.
Take care, my friend. Bye bye.